May 9, 1945. Cuxhaven, northern Germany, 0600 hours. The knock came before dawn. Not rifle butts, just two knuckles on wood. The nurses in the cellar flinched anyway. Above them, boots crossed floorboards. A voice descended, accented but clear. "Schwester, you are needed." They had scrubbed blood for 3 years under the swastika. Now the swastika was ash. What came next, they'd been told in whispers and propaganda reels, in the trembling certainty of defeat, would be retribution. They braced for shouting. The first word they heard was please. By noon, 23 German nurses of the Deutsches Rotes Kreuz stood in a British field hospital surrounded by men they'd been trained to fear. By evening, they held cups of tea in undamaged china, staring at the steam as if it were a forgotten language. The war had taught them to expect punishment. What they received was something far more disorienting: decency. This is the story of what happened when the enemy refused to behave like one. They had expected darkness. What they got was a procedure. The British medical officer who entered the cellar carried no weapon. His uniform was clean, improbably neat. He held a clipboard. He spoke careful German, reading from a typed sheet. "You will be transported to a British medical facility. You will work under supervision. You will not be harmed." Greta, 24, from Lübeck, 3 years in field hospitals, waited for the clause. "You will not be harmed unless—" It never came. The officer folded the paper, nodded, and left. The door stayed open. They gathered what little they had: a few photographs, a wool coat, a prayer book, a letter never sent. Outside, a British lorry idled in the gray morning. Not a cattle car, not a cage, just a canvas-covered truck with wooden benches, the type used for supplies and personnel. It carried the living, not condemned. The drive took 6 hours through rubble that had been Bremerhaven. Past refugees, surrendered Wehrmacht, children waving at convoys, farmland greening beneath a spring that didn't care who won. The nurses sat silent, hands folded, watching collapse roll past. Liesel, 31, a surgical assistant who had learned her trade in peacetime and perfected it in hell, wrote later in her hidden diary, "I thought I would see hatred in their faces. I saw only exhaustion. Perhaps we all look the same now. If this moment has already changed how you see the war, subscribe. The next will surprise you more." These were not ideologues, they were nurses. Greta joined the DRK in 1942 after her brother died in North Africa. Liesel was conscripted in 1943. Margot, barely 19, had been pulled from nursing school in Munich and deployed to a field hospital in Normandy 3 weeks before D-Day. They had worked under bombardment, under shortages, under the slow realization that the promises of victory were vapor. They saved lives because that was the job. They watched men die because the war did not care about the job. By May 1945, their hospital dissolved into chaos. Doctors fled, officers burned files. The nurses stayed because there were still wounded and still work. When the British arrived, the nurses stayed at their posts. They did not resist, they did not run. A British captain found them in a surgical theater, scrubbing instruments with cold water and lye soap, and said, "Right then, you'll do." That was the capture, no interrogation. No ceremony, just the war ending mid-sentence and someone handing you a new paragraph. The transport to England took 2 more days. First a train to the coast packed with German POWs, soldiers mostly, silent, defeated, some in uniform, some in rags. The nurses sat in a separate carriage guarded by a single British corporal who spent most of the journey reading a paperback and eating an apple. At the port, they boarded a Liberty ship that smelled of diesel, salt, and faint antiseptic from its conversion to transport. The crossing was calm. The North Sea, for once, cooperated. They were given blankets, thick wool, military issue, and rations. Tinned meat, hard biscuit, tea with real sugar. Margot held the paper sugar packet in her palm as if it might evaporate. On deck, under guard but not confined, they watched the white cliffs rise through mist. England, the enemy's home. The island that had been bombed, besieged, and never broken. They expected barbed wire and searchlights. What they saw was a crane unloading crates. Crates marked medical supplies priority, and a Red Cross banner hanging from a warehouse roof, flapping in the wind like a promise. The pivot came in a corridor. They were processed at a military depot. Names recorded, photographs taken, checked for disease. Efficient, impersonal. Then they were led through long green-painted hallways, footsteps echoing on linoleum until they reached a door marked Ward 7. A British nurse opened it. Older, graying, brisk. and looked them over with the eye of someone used to chaos. "You'll need aprons and these." She handed them uniforms, not prison smocks, nurse uniforms. White cotton, clean, with working buttons and a pocket for a watch. The DRK insignia had been removed. The rest was dignified, functional, unmarked by punishment. Greta stared at it. Liesel's hands shook. Margot whispered, "Warum, why?" The British nurse didn't understand German, but she understood the question. She pointed toward the ward beyond, rows of wounded soldiers. "Because we need nurses," she said. "And you are nurses." That was the moment. Not cruelty, not revenge recognition. They expected to be treated as enemies. Instead, they were treated as colleagues. There was a memo, unknown to them, circulated since 1940. Prisoners of war are soldiers under constraint, not slaves. They would be treated per the Geneva Convention. Cruelty forbidden, respect expected. 6 words buried in bureaucracy. Prisoners are soldiers, not slaves. Around that, a philosophy had grown. Pragmatism, morality, and a cold diplomatic calculation. Treat prisoners well and your own men might be treated well. Show civilization and undermine enemy propaganda. Maintain order through decency, not terror, because terror was what the enemy did. Britain chose deliberately not to become the enemy, to defeat it. It wasn't kindness. It was restraint. Restraint under pressure, restraint when instinct screamed for vengeance. Restraint codified into policy, enforced by officers who knew that wars end but reputations remain. The German nurses knew none of this. They knew only the clean fabric in their hands, the impossible gentleness of being issued something whole. Their first shift was agony, moral more than physical. They worked under supervision, post-op care, wound dressing, hygiene. The patients were Allied soldiers, men who had fought Germany, who had friends buried under German artillery, who had every reason to spit at a German nurse. Some did. A Manchester corporal refused treatment from Margot until a British nurse intervened. An Ontario private glared at Liesel with ice. But most simply lay exhausted, grateful for competent hands, too tired for ideology. A Scottish sergeant recovering from shrapnel watched Greta silently for 2 days before speaking. "You're good at this," Greta startled. "Danke, thank you," he nodded. "My sister's a nurse in Edinburgh. You remind me of her." That was all. No absolution, no apology. Just recognition, skill seeing skill, humanity under the uniform. Greta finished the dressing, her throat tight, her hands steady. If you're seeing the war in a new light, subscribe. The next scene will challenge you even more. Daily life settled into rhythm. They woke at 6. Roll call in the courtyard. Not prisoners for inspection, but staff reporting for duty. Breakfast in the mess hall, porridge, toast, tea, sometimes an egg. Plain, rationed, reliable, no one starved. No one fought over scraps. They worked 8-hour shifts. Mornings in the wards, changing dressings, giving medications, assisting with minor procedures. Afternoons in supply rooms, sterilizing instruments, rolling bandages, checking inventory. The work felt familiar, grounding. A return to rhythm after years when hospitals became triage centers and surgery became improvisation under fire. Evenings allowed limited movement. A small library, a courtyard, a radio playing BBC News then music, swing, jazz, orchestral pieces that felt like artifacts from another world. Some German nurses listened. Some avoided it, unwilling to hear the war retold. Liesel wrote letters home that might never be delivered. Margot learned English with a phrase book from the library. Bread, water, thank you, I understand. They weren't free, but they weren't prisoners in the way they'd feared. Boundaries existed, but inside them life resumed. The hospital ran on British discipline, punctuality, protocol, belief that order could be maintained even after collapse. German nurses, trained under similar rigor but under a different flag, found the structure oddly comforting. They knew how to live by rules. They had survived the war by following orders. Now the orders were different and, crucially, not cruel. Still, moments cracked the surface. A British orderly knocked over a tray of instruments in a hallway. The crash rang out, sudden, metallic, violent. 3 German nurses flinched hard, hands up, bodies tense as if expecting a blow. The orderly froze, horrified. "Christ, I'm sorry. I didn't mean..." Greta lowered her hand, her voice steady though her face was pale. "It is all right. We are still learning peace." He nodded quietly, gathered the instruments, and later brought them tea during their break. No words, just 3 cups. A small apology for a violence that wasn't even intentional. Another day, Margot assisted in surgery when the patient began shouting in delirium. She didn't understand most of it, but she heard German spat like venom. The Welsh surgeon glanced at her and said calmly, "Ignore him. You're doing fine." Then to the patient, voice like iron, "That's enough. The nurse is here to help you." "Behave," the patient quieted. Margot's hands never shook. But later she leaned against a washroom wall, breathing hard for a full minute, steadying herself against the mix of fear, shame, and something else. Gratitude that someone defended her when she could not. Lysel kept writing. "We are ghosts in their world. We wear their uniforms, speak their language badly, move through their spaces with permission but not belonging." She thought she'd feel like a prisoner. Instead, she felt like a stranger shown undeserved kindness. She worked in the surgical ward, assisting with amputations, infections, the slow grinding aftermath of battle. The British surgeons were skilled, methodical. After weeks, they trusted her with more responsibility, watching her work with quiet approval. One evening, a Canadian doctor asked her to assist with a complex debridement. Midway, he paused and asked, "Where did you train?" "Hamburg," she replied, "before the war." He nodded. "Good school. I can tell." No politics, just one professional acknowledging another. When the surgery was done, he removed his gloves. "Thank you, nurse, well done." Lysel almost wept. Christmas 1945 arrived with snow. The war had been over 7 months. Some German nurses had been repatriated. Others still waited for decisions far above them. The hospital decorated sparingly. A wreath in the mess, candles in the chapel, a small tree in the staff lounge with paper garlands made by recovering soldiers. On Christmas Eve, staff held a service. The German nurses weren't required to attend, but weren't forbidden. Some attended out of curiosity, some out of longing for normalcy. The chaplain read from scripture about peace on earth. A British nurse sang a carol in a clear soprano. The room was warm, dim, smelling of pine. For a moment, the war felt very far away. Greta stood in the back, hands clasped. She didn't sing, she didn't pray. But when the service ended, a British matron approached her gently. "Merry Christmas, Nurse Miller." Greta hesitated, then replied softly, "And to you." It was the first time she'd said the word since 1938. After the holidays came winter illnesses, pneumonia, frostbite complications among soldiers who'd been prisoners of war in Germany. Some recognized the accents of the German nurses. A few turned their faces away. Others surprisingly thanked them. One former POW, gaunt and pale, stopped Liesel before she left his bedside. "I don't blame you," he said quietly. "Most of us were just doing what we were told." She didn't know how to answer. She simply nodded, adjusting his blanket before walking away. The months blurred into routine. Sterilize, prep, assist, clean, rest. Yet something was changing. The British staff no longer watched them with caution, but with familiarity. The German nurses began to laugh again, quietly, carefully, but genuinely. By spring 1946, the hospital prepared new protocols. Europe was rebuilding. Nations were redefining themselves, and the roles of former enemy nationals were under review. Rumors spread. Repatriation lists were being finalized. Decisions were imminent. Some nurses packed in secret, afraid of sudden orders. Others refused to prepare, hoping delaying the act might delay the outcome. Greta kept her belongings folded in a single suitcase, half full. Ready to leave, ready to stay, uncertain which she feared more. The British matron summoned them to the administrative office. The mood was tense. They stood in a row, hands clasped behind their backs as if awaiting inspection. Instead, the matron spoke gently. "You will receive your assignments by the end of the week." Assignments, not verdicts. The word alone eased the air. For some, it meant returning to Germany. For others, especially those with essential skills, it meant extended service under British command. Not freedom exactly, but not exile either. Liesel was assigned to remain 6 more months, Margot too. Greta held her breath when her name was called. "Nurse Miller, extended assignment duration 12 months. Greta exhaled slowly, relief first, then a strange ache of uncertainty. That night in the dormitory, the emotions broke through. Some cried in relief, some cried in disappointment. Some simply sat in silence, absorbing the news. Greta lay awake long after lights out, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet breathing around her. She wondered what her husband would think, if he was still alive somewhere in the ruins of Europe. She wondered if her children, scattered by evacuation, would ever know where she'd been. She wondered if serving under a former enemy made her a traitor or a survivor, Life settled into a new pattern. The German nurses were no longer temporary workers but part of the hospital machine. They trained new British recruits demonstrating techniques learned in German clinics. Expertise transcended borders more easily than trust. One evening after a long shift, Margot sat outside on a bench beneath a blossoming tree. A British orderly joined her, offering half a chocolate bar, a precious ration. She hesitated, then accepted. They ate in silence, sharing something small but deeply human. Spring warmed the countryside. Patients improved. New casualties were rare. For the first time since any of them could remember, the world felt like it might be tilting toward healing instead of destruction, and slowly the nurses allowed themselves to believe it.